Crystal chandeliers dripped golden light over the grand ballroom of the Sterling International Hotel, where the city's elite had gathered for a private corporate dinner. The air smelled of wealth, truffle dishes, aged wine, expensive perfume. At the head table sat Charles Whitmore, a man who had become a billionaire before 50. His company had just announced a $500 million partnership with a European conglomerate. Tonight's dinner was his victory lap. He raised his glass, his voice booming across the room, to the future of international business. He declared, grinning as applause filled the hall. The guests cheered. Journalists scribbled notes. Investors whispered about profits. And moving quietly between the tables, unnoticed in her black and white uniform, was Danielle Carter, a young black waitress balancing trays with grace. Charles was never one to hide his arrogance. Midway through the evening, he had his assistant bring forward a thick contract, bound in leather, stamped with European seals. "This," he announced proudly, "is our German deal. Proof that Whitmore Industries is destined to dominate the skies of Europe." He tapped the contract with a finger, grinning. "Of course, it's all in German, the language of efficiency and precision. And naturally, I know enough to handle it myself." Guests laughed politely. A few clapped. Charles began reading a passage aloud in heavily butchered German, his accent so poor that several Europeans in the crowd winced. Still, no one dared correct him, except one. Danielle passed by, setting down a tray of champagne flutes. She froze for a split second, her ears catching every mangled syllable. She knew German fluently, and what Charles had just said wasn't just wrong. It was dangerously misleading. Her heart pounded. She had learned to stay invisible in rooms like this. But something inside her whispered, "Say it." She turned slightly, her voice steady but quiet. "That's not what it means." It was as if the chandeliers stopped glowing. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward the waitress who had just interrupted a billionaire. Charles blinked, stunned. "What did you say?" Danielle straightened, her tray still balanced effortlessly in her hand. She met his gaze without flinching. "I said, that's not what it means. The passage you just read, it doesn't say what you think it does." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few guests exchanged curious glances. A German investor in the corner raised his eyebrows. Charles forced a laugh, trying to mask his irritation. "And you would know that." "How?" "You're a waitress." Danielle's voice was calm, almost too calm. "I studied German for 7 years. I know exactly what that contract says. And it's not what you're telling them." The room froze. Glasses hovered midair. Investors leaned forward, waiting. Charles's smile faltered. He slammed the contract shut and waved a dismissive hand. "Enough. You're out of line." But the seed had been planted. Whispers spread like wildfire around the tables. What did she mean? Was Whitmore lying? And in that single moment, one quiet correction from a black waitress in a room full of power, a $500 million empire began to tremble. She had spoken the truth in a language most of them didn't understand. But soon everyone would realize what Danielle Carter had just done. Charles Whitmore wasn't just his CEO. He was the kind of man who enjoyed power like wine. He built his empire on mergers, acquisitions, and more than a few crushed competitors. The press called him visionary, but those who worked under him whispered other words: arrogant, ruthless, untouchable. At 52, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who had never been told no. His tailored suits, imported cigars, and million-dollar penthouse painted the picture of success. But behind closed doors, Charles had secrets. The German deal he boasted about was one of them. Few knew the details, and he intended to keep it that way. Danielle Carter, on the other hand, lived in a world as far from Charles's as night from day. She worked double shifts at the Sterling Hotel to keep the bills paid. Her apartment was small, the paint peeling, the heater unreliable. She wasn't just working for herself. At home waited her younger brother, Ethan, a high school senior with dreams of college. Danielle's paychecks kept him fed, clothed, and hopeful. But what no one in the glittering ballroom knew was that Danielle carried a secret of her own. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a linguist. Back in high school, Danielle had fallen in love with languages. While others struggled to conjugate verbs, she breezed through German, French, and Spanish. Words fascinated her. How one phrase could build bridges or break trust. Her grandmother, who once worked as a translator, nurtured this gift. Every Sunday, they would read German newspapers together. Danielle became fluent by 16 and later earned a partial scholarship to study linguistics. But when her mother passed away suddenly, dreams of university evaporated. Danielle had to step in as caretaker, working endless shifts to hold her family together. The books stayed, the fluency stayed, the passion stayed. Only the dream was put on hold. The Sterling International Hotel was a palace of wealth. Its ballrooms sparkled, its staff moved like shadows, and its guests were the top 1%. For Danielle, working there was both a blessing and a curse. She earned enough in tips to scrape by, but she also endured whispers, arrogance, and the condescension of the powerful. She had mastered the art of invisibility, the quiet smile, the bowed head, the careful step. Until last night, when Charles Whitmore's broken German collided with her truth. After Danielle's quiet correction, "That's not what it means," the ballroom had buzzed with whispers. Charles dismissed her, but investors left uneasy. Now, back in the staff quarters, Danielle felt the weight of what she'd done. Co-workers hissed in warning. "Are you crazy? You embarrassed him in front of everyone. Do you want to lose your job?" She sat silently, hands trembling. She hadn't planned it. The words had leapt out before she could stop them. But deep down, Danielle knew one thing. She had spoken the truth. Meanwhile, Charles sat in his penthouse suite, scotch in hand, replaying the moment. He told himself it was nothing, just a waitress speaking out of turn. And yet, the doubt gnawed at him. Why had she been so certain? Why had the German investors looked at him with suspicion afterward? His empire, built on bluster and intimidation, suddenly felt fragile. Two worlds had collided in that glittering ballroom. The ruthless billionaire and the waitress who refused to stay. Silent. What Charles didn't know was that Danielle Carter carried within her the power to unravel his empire, one Translation at a time. By the next morning, whispers from the gala had already spread, though no newspapers dared accuse Charles Whitmore outright. A few columns hinted at linguistic confusion. During his German announcement, investors had questions. His PR team scrambled. Charles, furious, slammed his fist on the conference table. One slip up and the vultures are circling. I won't have a waitress ruin me. His voice echoed like thunder. To him, Danielle Carter wasn't a person. She was an inconvenience to be erased. Asterisk 2 days later, Charles hosted a smaller luncheon at the city's elite aviation club. Journalists were invited, cameras flashing as he schmoozed and laughed loudly. Danielle didn't know she'd been reassigned there. The manager simply handed her the tray schedule. But when she entered the gilded dining hall and saw Charles at the head of the table, her stomach clenched. He noticed her instantly. His eyes gleamed with cold amusement. Midway through the luncheon, Charles tapped his champagne glass. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to prove that the misunderstanding from the other night was nothing more than nerves. He snapped his fingers at Danielle. You bring that contract. She froze, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. Sir, you corrected me once, he said smoothly, his voice dripping mockery. Why don't you translate a little for us now, HMM? Since you seem to know German so well. The table chuckled. Cameras flashed. Danielle's throat tightened. Dozens of eyes bored into her. She wasn't dressed for this. She wore her plain uniform. Her hands smelled faintly of dish soap. Her heart hammered in her chest. Charles leaned back, enjoying himself. Come now, tell us what this section says. Or perhaps you only pretend to know? The humiliation was sharp, deliberate. He wanted her to stumble, to confirm to everyone that she was just a waitress who got lucky. But Danielle steadied her breath. She glanced at the document, her eyes scanning the dense German text. In seconds, her training resurfaced. Asterisk she read aloud in clear, accented German, then translated. This section states that the subsidiary is responsible for environmental compliance costs, not the parent company. Which means, she looked directly at the investors present. Mr. Whitmore's claim of guaranteed profits is misleading. Gasps spread through the room. The journalist's pens flew. Charles's face flushed crimson. Enough, he barked. Out, now. Danielle's manager dragged her into the kitchen, hissing furiously. Do you realize what you've done? He owns half this city. But Danielle's hands no longer trembled. She had spoken truth, and the investors had heard it. Meanwhile, Charles stormed out, his smile gone. Rage burned in his chest. He muttered to his aide, if she thinks she can embarrass me twice, she has no idea who she's dealing with. Charles Whitmore believed power could silence anyone. But Danielle Carter had dared to speak again, and this time, her words carried a crack through which his entire $500 million empire might begin to crumble. Long before Danielle Carter stood in ballrooms correcting billionaires, her life was shaped inside a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the city's south side. The building was old, its paint peeling, pipes rattling with every winter gust. Yet within those walls lived a warmth stronger than poverty, the warmth of her family, her mother. Angela Carter, worked long shifts as a nurse's aide until illness claimed her strength. Her younger brother Ethan, bright-eyed and curious, spent evenings at the kitchen table sketching dreams of becoming an architect. And then there was Grandma Ruth, Danielle's anger, who filled the house with stories, prayers, and lessons. It was Grandma Ruth who handed Danielle her first German newspaper at age 11. Danielle still remembered that afternoon clearly. Rain tapped on the window, thunder rolled outside, and Ruth slid the folded paper across the table. "You want to open doors others can't even see?" her grandmother asked, eyes twinkling. "Learn their language." Danielle frowned. "But German?" Ruth chuckled. "Your grandfather worked in Berlin once. He taught me enough to read, enough to listen. I want you to take it further. Don't let your world be small, Donnie. Let your words travel." And so began her obsession. While other kids laughed at the mall, Danielle stayed up late with dictionaries, scribbling notes in spiral notebooks. She practiced verbs on index cards, taped vocabulary lists to the fridge, even whispered sentences under her breath as she swept floors. By 14, she could hold a conversation. By 16, she was fluent enough to translate passages for local immigrants at the clinic where her mother worked. Their gratitude lit a fire in her heart. Language, Danielle realized, is power. Her teachers noticed. They recommended scholarships, even wrote glowing recommendations. Danielle earned admission to a top linguistics program, tuition half covered. For the first time, escape from poverty seemed possible. But then tragedy struck. Angela's illness worsened. Hospital bills piled up like a mountain. Danielle stood in the kitchen one night, letter of acceptance in hand, while her mother's weak voice echoed from the bedroom. "Don't worry about me, Donnie. Chase your dream." But Danielle couldn't. She folded the letter away and put on a waitress apron instead. From then on, Danielle became both provider and protector. She worked nights, studied whenever she could, and never told Ethan how much she sacrificed. Grandma Ruth reminded her, even if you don't go to school, keep learning. Knowledge doesn't vanish just because the world won't pay for it. So Danielle never stopped. German novels, audiobooks, online lectures, her free minutes were never wasted. It was this hidden reservoir of knowledge that erupted years later in that glittering ballroom. When arrogance butchered truth and her conscience refused silence, there was one more voice that shaped her. Her father, Marcus, who had left when she was young. He wasn't always present, but his letters from overseas carried one message again and again. Danielle, never let anyone tell you your worth. They'll look at your skin, your job, your uniform, and they'll try. But worth is something you decide. She clung to those words the way a pilot clings to a compass in storm. Danielle Carter was not simply a waitress. She was the product of storms and sacrifice. A woman whose voice carried generations of lessons. And while Charles Whitmore tried to humiliate her, he could not erase the truth forged by late nights, old newspapers, and a grandmother's belief. Her past had armed her for the battle ahead. The battle that would decide the fate of a $500 million empire. If the apartment was Danielle's battlefield, then the small wooden kitchen table was her command center. Its surface was covered in coffee rings, scratches, and stacks of books. German dictionaries leaned against recipe cards. A Bible sat next to a battered grammar manual every evening after shifts. Danielle sat across from Grandma Ruth. They drank tea, Ruth always with honey, Danielle with lemon, and read aloud together. Sprich mit Berzoging. Donny, Ruth would say, her German lilting and imperfect. Speak with conviction. If you believe your words, others will too. Those nights gave Danielle more than vocabulary. They gave her a spine of steel. But outside their walls, the city wasn't kind. Danielle remembered the first time she corrected a teacher's German translation in high school. Instead of praise, she was met with raised eyebrows. "Are you sure, Danielle?" the teacher asked, doubt dripping from his tone. "It's just surprising, you know. For someone like you." The implication stung. Someone like you. But when the textbook confirmed she was right, Danielle caught Ruth's voice in her head. Sprich mit Berzoging. From then on, she decided never to swallow truth, no matter how inconvenient. One summer, when Danielle was 19, she took a part-time job at the airport gift shop. It was monotonous work, selling magazines and bottled water. But one afternoon, a frazzled German couple rushed in, lost and desperate. Their connecting flight had been cancelled, and no one understood them. Without hesitation, Danielle stepped in. She translated their pleas for the airline staff, arranged their rebooking, even helped them navigate customs. The couple wept with gratitude, pressing a €50 note into her hand. The airline manager pulled her aside later. "You just saved us hours of chaos. Ever thought of becoming a translator?" Her chest swelled with pride, but reality snapped back quickly. Translators needed certifications, degrees she couldn't afford. Still, the moment lit something inside her, proof that her gift mattered in the real world. The hardest night came when Ruth's health began to fail. Danielle sat by her bedside, tears stinging her eyes as machines beeped steadily. Ruth took her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me, Donny. The world will try to make you small, but you carry a weapon they can't see, knowledge. Use it. When the moment comes, don't be afraid to stand." Those were Ruth's last words to her. Danielle wept for days, but the lesson carved itself into her bones. By the time she was 26, Danielle lived into realities. By day, she carried trays, smiled politely, and became invisible. By night, she devoured foreign articles online, watching debates in German, jotting down idioms and proverbs. Sometimes she whispered sentences to herself in the mirror, pretending she was on a stage, not in a service uniform. Sprich mit Berzoging. So when Charles Whitmore misread his contract at the gala, Danielle didn't think. She reacted. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her chest. "That's not what it means." The courage wasn't sudden. It was built over years, through Ruth's table, through prejudice, through the airport encounter, through grief. And though the world saw only a black waitress in a pressed uniform, Danielle knew she carried a fire that even billionaires couldn't extinguish. Behind every fearless moment is a story of scars, lessons, and voices that refuse to fade. Danielle Carter's strength wasn't born in the ballroom. It was forged in kitchens, gift shops, and hospital rooms. And now, As Charles plotted her downfall, he didn't realize he was up against not just a waitress, but a lifetime of resilience. Charles Whitmore wasn't used to being challenged. For decades, his voice had been law in boardrooms, his smile enough to calm investors, his glare enough to silence employees. But now, everywhere he turned, there were whispers at the stock exchange. Did you hear? The German contract might not be as airtight as he claims. Asterisk in the press, a waitress corrects a billionaire who really knows the deal better. Charles slammed his phone on the marble countertop of his penthouse. She thinks she can humiliate me twice? I'll bury her. The next evening at the Sterling Hotel, Danielle was summoned to the back office. Her manager stood stiff, eyes darting nervously as Charles himself lounged in a leather chair, scotch in hand. Well, Charles said, his voice smooth but venomous. The linguistic prodigy herself. Danielle's hands curled at her sides, but her chin didn't drop. Mr. Whitmore, he leaned forward. You're playing a dangerous game, girl. Do you know who I am? I could make one call, and you'd never work in this city again. Her heart pounded, but her voice stayed steady. I'm not playing a game. I told the truth. His jaw tightened. Truth is what I say it is, and you do well to remember your place. But outside those walls, the truth had already begun leaking. A German investor, Herr Klaus Reinhardt, quietly confirmed Danielle's correction. She was right, he told reporters. The contract doesn't guarantee what Whitmore claims. In fact, it shifts liability in a dangerous way. Other investors began calling emergency meetings. For the first time in years, Charles's empire trembled, and Danielle, though threatened, became a name whispered in corporate corridors. The waitress who exposed the billionaire. Danielle herself struggled in silence. After shifts, she lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling of her apartment, Ethan snoring softly in the next room. Fear gnawed at her. What if Charles ruins me? What if I can't keep this job? But then she remembered Ruth's words, sprich mit Beherzigung. Speak with conviction. Her grandmother hadn't raised her to bow to bullies. Within a week, media vans parked outside Whitmore Industries. Cameras swarmed at every appearance. Mr. Whitmore, can you clarify the translation errors? Is it true your deal is misleading investors? What about the waitress's claims? Charles snarled into microphones. Baseless lies. She's nobody. But the more he denied, the more curious people became. Why was he so rattled by a waitress, unless she was right? At the Airlux Club, Charles gathered his loyalists. We need to shut this down before it spreads further. Connor, one of his younger associates, whispered, But sir, what if she speaks again? What if she has proof? Charles's glass shattered against the wall. She won't. But deep down, a knot of dread coiled in his stomach. Danielle Carter had already proven she wasn't afraid of him. And worse, she knew the truth. The billionaire had money, power, and lawyers. The waitress had only her knowledge and her courage. But in a world built on lies, sometimes truth is the most dangerous weapon of all. And soon, both Charles Whitmore and Danielle Carter would find themselves face to face in a battle that no chandelier-lit ballroom could contain. It Was it Tuesday afternoon when Danielle's manager stormed into the staff room, face pale? Danielle, upstairs. Now, her stomach dropped. What's going on? Investors, the German delegation. They specifically asked for you. Every head in the staff room turned. A waitress being summoned to the executive conference floor? Unheard of. Danielle's pulse quickened. She smoothed her apron, whispered a prayer, and followed the trembling manager through gilded corridors. Inside, the room buzzed with tension. The German investors sat stiffly, contracts spread before them. Charles Whitmore stood at the head, his forced smile barely holding. Cameras were absent, but the weight of billions hung in the air. And then Klaus Reinhardt, the elder investor with piercing blue eyes, spoke. "Bring in the waitress." Gasps rippled. Charles's jaw clenched. "This is absurd." But Klaus lifted a hand. "If you have nothing to hide, let her read. Let truth speak." Danielle stepped forward, every nerve alight. She glanced at the thick stack of documents, German text dense and intimidating. But to her, the words flowed like rivers she had swum all her life. Her voice rang clear as she read a section aloud in German, then translated into English. "This clause does not guarantee projected profits. It assigns all environmental compliance costs to subsidiaries, meaning losses will be absorbed there, shielding the parent company." A hush fell over the table. Investors leaned in, brows furrowed. Charles slammed his palm on the table. "Lies. She's twisting words. She's a waitress, for God's sake." But Klaus Reinhardt shook his head slowly. "Neen, she is correct." Another investor whispered, "If this is true." Whitmore's entire pitch is built on deception. Papers shuffled. Voices overlapped. Danielle was asked to translate section after section. Each time, she spoke calmly, flawlessly. Her German was so precise it silenced doubt. With each translation, cracks appeared in Charles's empire. Clauses revealed hidden risks, buried liabilities, and promises that were smoke and mirrors. Charles's forehead glistened with sweat. For the first time in decades, the room wasn't hanging on his words. It was hanging on hers. When she finished, Klaus leaned back, folding his hands. "Denk, Fräulein Carter, you have done us a great service." He turned to Charles. "Mr. Whitmore, explain why you misrepresented this deal to us." Charles sputtered. This is outrageous. She doesn't know what she's talking about. She's nothing." But his protest sounded weak, almost childish, against the clarity of her translations. Danielle's knees trembled beneath her uniform, but her eyes didn't waver. For years she had been invisible, her brilliance hidden behind trays and aprons. Now, in the room where power was currency, her words carried more weight than a billionaire's single quotes as dot. And for the first time, Charles Whitmore felt the walls of his empire close in. A waitress had spoken, and the room had listened. In that moment, power shifted. The billionaire's lies, once untouchable, now stood exposed by the very person he had mocked. But the battle wasn't over. Charles Whitmore wasn't a man who surrendered quietly, and the storm he would unleash next would test Danielle more than ever. Charles Whitmore stormed into his private office, face red with fury. His aides trailed behind nervously, carrying folders and phones. "She humiliated me in front of investors," Charles roared, throwing his glass against the wall. "If this gets out, the press will crucify me. We'll lose billions." One aide murmured, "Sir, the board has already called an emergency session. They want explanations." Charles froze. The board, for years, they had rubber-stamped every move. But now, doubt was spreading like wildfire. The following morning, the boardroom was a battlefield. Suits filled the long mahogany table, their eyes sharp, their whispers sharper. At the head sat Margaret Liu, chairwoman of the board, a woman who had seen too many empires fall to arrogance. "Mr. Whitmore," she began coldly, "your investors are demanding clarification. We've received troubling reports that your German deal was misrepresented." Charles forced a smile. "Misunderstandings, language barriers. You know how these things are." But Margaret's gaze didn't soften. "And yet a waitress managed to identify errors you, with your army of lawyers, could not?" The silence was suffocating. And then, the unthinkable. Margaret ordered, "Bring her in." Danielle froze when the call came. She stood outside the boardroom doors, palms clammy, uniform stiff. Every instinct screamed at her to run. She was just a waitress. What business did she have here? But Ruth's voice echoed in her heart. "Sprich mit Zugang." The doors opened. She stepped inside. Dozens of powerful eyes turned toward her. Charles sneered. "This is absurd. You'd take the word of a girl in an apron over mine?" Margaret ignored him. "Miss Carter, please, read this." They slid a document toward her. Danielle inhaled, scanning the German text. Her voice, steady and clear, translated clause after clause, each one another nail in Charles's coffin. Board members exchanged dark looks. The scale of deception was undeniable. Charles shot to his feet. "This is a coup. She's lying. Or worse, she's been bribed. You think some waitress has more credibility than me?" Margaret's voice cut like ice. "No, Charles. We think truth has more credibility than you." The room erupted in murmurs. For the first time in his career, Charles Whitmore felt the ground vanish beneath him. Even as she stood tall, Danielle's heart thundered. She thought of Ethan, of unpaid bills, of nights carrying trays while others lived lives of ease. Was she really strong enough to topple a giant? And yet, as she looked round the room, she saw it. Respect, recognition, for the first time. People of power weren't looking through her. They were listening. Charles slumped back into his chair, sweat trickling down his temple. The empire he had built on intimidation, smoke, and mirrors was unraveling, not by a rival CEO, not by a hostile takeover, but by a waitress with the courage to say, "That's not what it means." The billionaire's fortress of lies had been breached, but the war wasn't over. Charles still had resources, allies, and fury. And Danielle Carter, though victorious in the moment, had no idea how dangerous a cornered billionaire could become. A billionaire with pride. Wounded is more dangerous than one who's losing money. And Charles Whitmore was both. Within hours of the board meeting, his PR machine spun into action. Headlines screamed, "Waitress with hidden agenda?" Is Danielle Carter working for Whitmore's rivals? Anonymous blogs smeared her name, whispering about bribes, affairs, ulterior motives. Danielle's phone buzzed non-stop with unknown numbers, threats, even cruel laughter. But through the chaos, Ethan looked her in the eye one evening and said, "Donnie, you didn't do anything wrong. Don't let him scare you." It was all she needed. Charles wasn't finished. He filed an injunction demanding that Danielle cease all public commentary about the deal. His lawyers descended like hawks, briefcases snapping open with pages of intimidation. But Klaus Reinhardt and several German investors stepped forward. "We will support her," Klaus said firmly. "She is the only one who has spoken truth." For the first time, Danielle wasn't alone. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the benches, cameras flashed outside, and the world watched. Charles sat with his high-priced attorneys, radiating confidence like armor. Danielle sat at the other table, nerves quaking but chin lifted. The judge gestured. "Miss Carter, translate this section for the court." A hush fell. Danielle inhaled, the pages blurring for a moment, then sharpening into perfect clarity. She read in German, then translated flawlessly. "This clause states that projected returns are conditional, not guaranteed. Any claim otherwise is fraudulent." Gasps rippled. Reporters scribbled furiously. Charles leapt up. "She's lying. She's a nobody, an uneducated girl pretending to know more than professionals." But the judge's gavel cracked. "Order!" And then Klaus's voice rang out from the gallery. "She is no liar. Every word she speaks matches our lawyer's independent review. Whitmore deceived us all." The final crack echoed like thunder. By evening, the verdict was clear. Whitmore's deal was fraudulent. The board voted to suspend him. Investors withdrew. Stocks plummeted. Charles Whitmore's empire, once untouchable, was collapsing before the world's eyes, and the face on every news outlet wasn't his. It was Danielle's. Reporters swarmed her outside the courthouse. "Miss Carter, how does it feel to take down a billionaire?" She swallowed hard, voice calm but resolute. It wasn't about taking anyone down. It was about truth. And truth belongs to everyone, not just the powerful. Cameras flashed. Her words flew across headlines. The mighty had fallen, not by another titan, but by a waitress who refused to stay silent. Yet even as the dust settled, Danielle's journey was not over. For with every ending comes a beginning, and her next chapter would prove that. Courage doesn't just expose lies. It builds futures. Charles Whitmore's name, once gilded in boardrooms, now flashed across headlines as a cautionary tale. Whitmore exposed in $500 million fraud. From power to pariah, the fall of a titan. His penthouse grew silent as staff resigned. His calendar emptied. Former allies refused his calls. The man who once commanded nations with a glance now sat alone in marble halls that felt like tombs. And in that silence, he replayed one haunting moment again and again. "That's not what it means." Asterisk the words of a waitress, now his undoing. For Danielle, life transformed overnight. News outlets called her the truth-telling waitress. Social media hailed her courage. Students carried signs quoting her outside universities. Truth belongs to everyone. But Danielle never sought fame. When reporters crowded her doorstep, she smiled humbly and said, "I just did what anyone should do. I spoke the truth." Investors offered her scholarships. Klaus Reinhardt personally invited her to study linguistics in Berlin, all expenses paid. Universities begged her to speak for the first time. Danielle felt doors opening not because of money, but because of married daughter home. Ethan burst into the apartment one evening waving a newspaper. "Donnie, look, you're on the front page again." She laughed, pulling him into a hug. "Don't let it get to my head, okay?" His eyes shone. "You showed the world what I already knew. You're unstoppable." Danielle's heart swelled. All the nights she had worked double shifts, all the meals skipped, all the sacrifices. They were worth it. Weeks later, Danielle walked past Whitmore Industries headquarters. Reporters no longer gathered outside. The building stood eerily quiet. Through the glass doors she glimpsed Charles once, shoulders slumped, a man shrunken by disgrace. For a moment, pity tugged at her, but then she remembered the arrogance, the intimidation, the lies he spun to rob millions. She whispered softly, not for him, but for herself, "Truth always outlives lies," and walked on. Months later, Danielle stood on a stage at a university auditorium, invited as a keynote speaker. Students filled every seat. Professors leaned forward, notebooks open. She spoke not of her own glory, but of her grandmother's lessons. "My grandma Ruth used to tell me, sprich mit Berzoging, speak with conviction. Truth doesn't need a title, or a suit, or $1 billion empire. Sometimes it only needs a voice brave enough to be heard." Thunderous applause followed. Danielle smiled through tears, knowing Ruth would have been proud. Narrator's voice. In the end, it wasn't money or power that saved a $500 million deal from deception. It was the courage of one waitress who refused to stay silent, because truth is not owned by the powerful. Truth belongs to anyone willing to speak it. And sometimes, the quietest voice in the room is the one that changes everything. So the next time you see someone dismissed, mocked, or ignored, remember Danielle Carter. Because history isn't always written by the billionaires. Sometimes it's written by the waitress who dares to say, "That's not what it means." If you believe truth can change the world, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories.